Good morning from Oklahoma. I'm Dave Deken with a look at what's happening in agriculture and rural life across our great state in this episode of Red Dirt and Round Bales. Some crops are a little more forgiving than others. And sorghum, well, sorghum has earned that reputation. We had a great response last week when we were talking about sorghum, so I thought we would dig a little deeper into the nutrient needs of the crop in Oklahoma. Sorghum can stand some heat, and it can handle dry weather better than a lot of crops. It has been a dependable crop across Oklahoma and the southern Great Plains for a long time, because it knows how to survive when the weather gets stingy. Now, with that said, it still needs fertility and timing. And when we talk about nitrogen, timing can make all of the difference. Today, we're hearing from my friend Dr. Raedan Sharry with Oklahoma State University about something called delayed nitrogen management. That phrase sounds a little technical, but the idea is pretty simple. Instead of putting all of your nitrogen out before planting, you might hold some back and apply it later in the season, closer to the time when the sorghum plant can really use it. Now, if you've heard delayed nitrogen talked about in winter wheat, this is kind of a similar idea. The goal is to match the fertilizer with the crop's appetite, because we all know that nitrogen is not cheap. And if it's applied too early, or if it just sits on the soil surface without a rain, some of that nitrogen can be lost before the crop ever has a chance to use it. So the question becomes, can we feed sorghum a little closer to supper time? The answer is, and I say this with love, kind of an extension answer here, it depends. That is probably the most important part of this whole conversation. Delayed nitrogen is not a blanket recommendation. In a high-yield situation where the stand looks good, moisture is available, and that field has a real grain potential, moving nitrogen later can help put more of that fertility into the grain. But in a lower-yield field or a late-planted field, it may not work the same way. The sorghum plant may need nitrogen earlier, especially if the grower is depending on the tillers to help build yield. So the answer is not always delay. The better answer is know what kind of crop you have. Now, Dr. Sharry also talks about a key point in a plant's life, panicle differentiation. Now, that just means the stage when the plant begins forming the head, the part that will eventually carry the grain. Now, once that process starts, the clock really matters.
When we move that nitrogen season, we're able to translocate more of that nitrogen, use more of it in the uptake of the plant, and have it go to grain yield. Now, if we're talking about lower yield situations or late planted sorghum, where we're talking about maybe yield situations where we're talking about 30, 40, 50 bushels, something like that, we may not see that same benefit to delayed nitrogen, and a lot of times we may be better off if we're managing for those low yield potential scenarios, putting that nitrogen up front, allowing that plant to really take advantage of that nitrogen early for tillering, instead of just primarily putting all that energy into one main stem head on the sorghum plant. And so what we've seen, if we kind of think about that physiological calendar for that plant, as we move through the season, we really want to have that nitrogen coming into the plant by 63 days after planting, approximately based on our data.
So here's the plain spoken version. It's not enough to apply nitrogen by a certain date. That nitrogen has to be available to the plant. And in Oklahoma, that usually means one thing. You need rainfall to move it to the root zone. A fertilizer application sitting on dry ground is not the same as nitrogen feeding the crop. That is why delayed nitrogen can be useful. It gives growers flexibility. Now you can look at the crop, you can look at the forecast, and you can make a better decision about whether that field still has yield potential to justify the fertilizer. And when it works, the benefit is not just yield, it is efficiency.
And so once we start talking about nitrogen application in season, one of the key aspects of the delayed nitrogen management system is that we're trying to increase nitrogen use efficiency. By moving that later in the season, we're taking more in and putting into bushels in the bin instead of being lost as biomass or lost to the environment through leaching or volatilization or these other lost pathways. And so at the end of the day, whenever we're talking about these high yield scenarios where we're applying lots of nitrogen and trying to be as efficient as possible to push grain yields, then we see a lot of benefit as far as being a conservative, being efficient with that nitrogen, which at the end of the day is going to help our bottom line for our growers when we think about pounds of N to pounds or bushels of grain per acre.
That is a big deal, because every pound of nitrogen that ends up in the grain is doing its job. Every pound that volatilizes, leaches, or goes into unnecessary biomass is money that did not come back. And that brings us to another practical piece, the nitrogen source. Urea, UAN, and ammonium nitrate do not all behave the same way. Some sources are more vulnerable to loss if they are left on the soil surface without rain. Dr. Sharry says rainfall after application is one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle.
If you're coming in and you're applying this nitrogen in pre-plant and you're applying it as urea broadcast over the top, you have a very high probability of volatilization of losses from that urea source. The same thing with UAN. Part of that nitrogen is going to be readily able to come into the ground. As soon as we get a rainfall, it's not going to be as volatile. Same thing with ammonium nitrate, where we have less likelihood of loss through volatilization. Then we're really just worried about, are we going to leach when we change those sources up? But at the end of the day, all of this comes back to rainfall. We have to get that rainfall event, try to within about 14 days. By the time we get to 5 days after application, specifically with urea, we're already talking about exponential losses over time. And so we really want to limit that. And that's one of the things that delayed nitrogen management gives us, is flexibility to get that nitrogen on at a time whenever the plant's going to be most able to use it, as well as take advantage of any rainfall events that we may be about to capture.
That is really the whole lesson. Delayed nitrogen is not magic. Used in the right field in the right season with the right timing, it can help growers be more efficient and maybe put more bushels in the bin. But if the crop is already limited by drought, late planting, poor stand, or low yield potential, then waiting too long may not pay. That's the thing about sorghum. It is tough, but it still responds to good management. It can take a hard year and keep standing, but when the season gives it a chance, you want the fertility at the right time. Not too early, not too late. Right when the plant is ready to turn it into grain. And around here, that is the kind of timing that can make a difference. Not just in the field, but on the bottom line. To learn more about the nutrient needs of sorghum in Oklahoma, visit reddirtandroundbales.com. I'm Dave Deken, and we'll talk with you next time when we take another look at rural life and agriculture in Oklahoma on Red Dirt and Round Bales.